Welcome to Sense and Sustainability, your podcast channel for sustainable procurement. We hope you like what you hear. Please go to www.iso2400.org for more information, learning resources, tools, and much more.
Welcome to Sense and Sustainability, your podcast for sustainable procurement. I'm Sean McCarthy, Director of Action Sustainability Community Interest Company, and I'm delighted to introduce my colleague Emma Jane Allen, known to everybody as EJ, in part two of our podcast recordings. And EJ is going to talk to us about modern slavery and due diligence.
Yeah, so I think we've explored loads of issues here, haven't we? But I think it's what's really helpful is to kind of understand really what is modern slavery, the definition of modern slavery, but then there are a whole range of other potential labour abuse issues that are not modern slavery, so they haven't had their passport taken away them, they're not forced to stay, but actually in some of the situations you describe, well, if you don't do what we ask, you're fired, and we'll get somebody who is prepared to do it. And in areas where people are desperate for the money, then that will happen, and not necessarily just in the developing world. There's lots of desperate people, in the UK, United States, European Union. So that's absolutely fascinating for people to learn and to understand. So that's brilliant. Thank you. Audits. You mentioned audits. In these terms, when you're looking at some of these human issues, would you like to talk a little bit about the value of audits? I mean, they have a part to play, but I guess in my view, it's not the whole story.
Yes, and that's hitting the nail on the head, Sean. That's what we say all the time, because so often when we're engaging with clients or delivering training workshops and you do the kind of audience engagement, what does due diligence mean? Audit, 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 that just pops up. And there is that false sense of security with businesses saying, well, we know that audits happen. We've built that into our contractual conditions that they must do audits. Okay, what are you asking? Who's doing the audits? What kind of questions are you asking? How are you getting that worker voice? How are you getting actually what's really happening rather than what's happening on the day of the audit? And there's the kind of look of, oh, okay. The cases that I just talked about, the Longcom and the deal, they'd had audits. I think the article that I read said, this is just one example of how audits can be really flawed. We've all heard the examples of cases, where people walk into a garment factory or a manufacturing facility and the music changes, and all the people who don't look exploited kind of appear and start working. People who are exploiting people they're again sophisticated techniques to hide under the radar. Audits are really useful if done well. They're great, but they can't be the sole kind of, this is our due diligence. It's everything from asking right through the procurement process, the questions you're asking at PQQ, how you're embedding them into the contract management. If you're doing audits, who's conducting the audits? Is it, if you're thinking about, you need somebody on the ground who understands the culture, who understands the language. I forget now which case it was, but I remember listening to, there was a guy who was doing a podcast, and he was talking about how he was a journalist and he'd managed to find one of the big kind of cases of labour exploitation. I think it was the PPE, the gloves in Malaysia. I think it might have been to do with Top Glove, and that happened it was COVID, wasn't it? And I think he'd managed to get to the bottom of what was happening, not because he turned up and did a factory visit and audit, but because he turned up at the factories at break times, or he went and spoke to people in that community in their villages, or a local celebration, I think it was now, and he talked to workers. He looked like one of them, he sounded like one of them, to find out what was happening. And that to me was so insightful. They'd had all these audits, nothing had been found, but you just have one person who understands the culture, the language, and wasn't threatening in any way. And guess what? They found out all sorts of abuses were happening.
Yeah, thank you. I think for our audience, I'd refer to a podcast that we did with a lady called Laura Dombey from D&B. She is a human rights auditor, but she has a very interesting view in terms of the role of audit compared to some of the things you described, EJ, about, you need to do everything. within your supply chain, and audits then therefore a kind of part of the toolkit rather than the whole thing. Okay, so yeah, we've covered a whole load of issues here. Do you have? We've talked about some companies that have been exposed, fined. Really interesting to hear about the Boohoo story, and the investors actually, are calling Boohoo to account because they've lost money, and that's a really interesting kind of risk for anybody in the private sector that has investment to consider. Do you have examples of good practice where, organizations are, I think there's nothing perfect, we know that. But where do you see organizations that are actually doing this well?
I was about to be glass half empty then and say, I'll tell you where they're not doing it so well, but I'm not going to do that.
No,
I would
let's
no,
end
no,
on
I
a
would
positive
no,
note.
I would say, I suppose in the retail sector, they've been doing this for a lot longer than others. So if you look at, organizations like Tesco, if you look at their policies and procedures, and like, again, this is probably surprising some people, but if you're thinking about remediation, which is the area that's very often kind of neglected, if you look at what Primark have done in the UK after what happened in the Rana Plaza, so that was in Bangladesh, wasn't it? Was that 10 years ago or 15 years ago, maybe, when the factory collapsed, killing thousands of workers? They'd had a building service, what do you call them? An audit of their buildings the day before, and then it collapsed the following day. So again, going back to the role of audits, and they've done a lot of work in looking at how they can support the people who were impacted by Rana Plaza. And they've worked with local partners to fund, well, at the time they worked with local partners to fund emergency food aid and financial support to all victims and their families. They create, I think it was, I'm not sure if it was Primark who did this, but a range of garment organisations, they worked together to create a database on all workers who were in the building to try and set up a helpline. And I believe I think it was about 3,000 workers and families received almost a year's salary in immediate compensation. Mobile phones were given out. And I'm not sure of the latest stats, but Primark continues to support those people who were affected. 5 years ago, was it 5 years ago or 5 years on? Can't remember. I think they contributed about $40 million worth of aid and compensation. So that's one example of remediation. Marshalls, the aggregate organisation, they are absolutely fantastic in their approach to due diligence. Everything from engaging the supply chain right through to embedding those KPIs, performance monitoring. They've got very, very clear KPIs around where they want to be each year. For example, what percentage of their high-risk supply chain to have given them detailed due diligence plans on their approach to addressing slavery.
Yeah, Marshalls have very long-term relationships as well, don't they, with
Yes.
their, like Korean suppliers in India and that sort of thing. And that's yeah, and it's all about working with the supply chain in the longer term.
Yes, and it's simpler because their product range is much narrower, which comes back to that idea of prioritization and risk, which we haven't talked about, but I'm guessing it's been talked about a lot in other sustainable procurement podcasts.
Great, absolutely brilliant, EJ. I think we've covered, as I say, we covered a lot of ground in this podcast, so thank you very much for that. Final question, a little bit similar to the earlier question I asked, I guess. A lot of our audience are starting their journeys in modern slavery, and that could be sometimes younger people coming into the first or second job in their careers, or even people that are more mature in their, for instance, in their procurement experience, have suddenly been asked to look at sustainability as a new issue. What would your advice be to somebody coming new into this topic?
I mean, a million and one things. So I'll just not necessarily in prioritized order, but just the things that spring into my mind. Just because you understand that modern slavery and human rights, it's not something, like I said, it's nice to have. It's an ethical and moral imperative. Just because you understand that, don't assume that others will do. So I would say get very comfortable with being able to articulate the business case, because people tasked with addressing modern slavery, sustainability through supply chains, their role, a lot of it is very much is about convincing other people. And that includes, that is kind of board level as well. I would say accept you can't tackle everything. If you're somebody who's naturally being concerned about people in general, about social injustice and so on, it's difficult because there's so much going on. Like, where the hell do you start? It's about accepting you can't tackle everything, and you need to take that prioritized approach and focus on where the biggest impacts are and the biggest risks. Note I say biggest impacts and risks, not just risks, and focusing on those areas, and just remember that perfection doesn't exist when you're talking about modern slavery or sustainability. We know what it looks like in our idealistic, minds, but trying to get there, we're a long way from that. Just when you think you've fully understood a particular issue, something else rears its head. Look at the whole issue with HVO as a substitute for diesel. Hugely challenging sector when you've got all these different issues: biodiversity, modern slavery, carbon, all these things to consider. I would say capture those case studies. When people talk about modern slavery, it's those real stories where people sit at the heart of them. Use those stories, remember those stories to demonstrate your points. It's that whole, storytelling will have an impact. Just telling people you shouldn't do this and you should do that, make it come alive. What else? The quote from, was it the CSO of IKEA? If we all have big ideas and this wonderful purpose, but don't bloody well get on with it, then what's the point? That's kind of for anyone, right? That's not necessarily to do with modern slavery. Don't talk, just take steps, take action. This is, I suppose, this is something I feel quite strongly about, is modern slavery is a really serious topic, but don't feel that just because you're working on addressing some of the, the most serious problems, you have to take yourself really seriously. I would say, you don't need to take yourself too seriously. That's a personal kind of recommendation. I suppose that's, that's me. What else? Remember the power of collaboration. Engage in stakeholder groups, engage in forums, get people in your organization involved, create modern slavery kind of champion networks. You can be responsible for upskilling them, even if it's an informal network or group of champions. There's that idea of, if you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, you go together. So that role of collaboration, working in teams. That's plenty of things. Is that enough to be going on with? I could go on.
I think that's enough. Yeah. I think that's enough. I love the idea that there's no such thing as perfection, which I think is a great lesson for life, not necessarily just in modern slavery. So EJ, you've talked in our discussion about various elements that make up the business case for addressing modern slavery, human rights. Would you like to summarise that business case for people? Because I think you said it's really important to be able to articulate it. How would that come together for you, for people to use and to understand?
Thanks, Sean. I would say it's a range of different kind of drivers, and of course, understanding the specific drivers for your business is really important if you're going to drive change, and the specific drivers of the leaders in your business. You'd like to think that would align, but that's really important. But for me, there's a range of drivers. You've got the one that's often forgotten, which is supply chain resilience. I mentioned how, in the case of the Bangladesh garment factories, how, where you've got risks of modern slavery or labour exploitation in your supply chain, no matter how far down, actually that can disrupt operations. You've got those production delays, it can damage that brand reputation. Linking to reputational risk, that tends to be a driver for a lot of businesses. But I would say ideally it wouldn't be the biggest driver for your business to address slavery and labour exploitation. If it is, it probably says quite a lot about your organisation's mission and values, but ultimately nobody wants to appear emblazoned across the headlines because of cases of modern slavery and labour exploitation if they can't show that they've been doing their best in their due diligence approach. There's the legislative drivers, actually, which are huge now. There's been this tsunami of global legislation over the last few years that's all about due diligence, human rights. You've got things like the German Supply Chain Due Diligence, is it Act or Directive? I can't remember now, where businesses can be fined 2% of turnover if they cannot demonstrate that they've been doing their best in their due diligence. So really important to understand that. If a case of modern slavery was found in their supply chain, in a business's supply chain, it doesn't mean to say that, okay, well, you're going to get fined 2% of global turnover, but you would be fined if you couldn't show that you're doing your best to identify, prevent, manage, and mitigate the risks of slavery. Okay. And then things like I talked about the European Due Diligence Directive, that's coming in. It's the same approach. It's not just about tell me what you've done to combat slavery. It's show me how are you proactively combating and addressing slavery and labour exploitation. So that's huge now. What else? What else? Supply chain transparency, actually, that's a huge one. So if you're engaging your supply chain and doing your modern slavery due diligence in a way that's not risk dumping, it's about working collaboratively with your supply chain and saying to them, we know there's risks, we need to manage them together, we need to get better at this. That kind of builds that culture of responsibility, of transparency and accountability. And that approach to collaboration and supply chain management, it helps foster stronger partnerships, the kind that are really invaluable when, you know, things are really volatile at the moment. We live in uncertain times and there's plenty more ahead. So I think that's also a key driver, that if you're doing your due diligence properly and effectively, you're building a culture of trust with your supply chain.
EJ, that's been fantastic. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I'm sure our audience will too. I'm sure they'll learn a lot about modern slavery and human rights as a result of listening to you. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks, Sean.
Thank you for listening to our podcast on sense and sustainability. Please listen out for more episodes. For more information, learning resources, tools, and much more content on sustainable procurement, go to www.iso2400.org.